Go ahead.
Okay, we are finishing up Worsby from yesterday. We are in Deuteronomy 20, and the verses that we're going to cover this morning are first starting with 10 to 20. Way outside the land. Moses had been instructing the people how to wage war in the land of Canaan, but now he deals with the battles they will fight outside the land. The Lord wanted to enlarge Israel's borders, and this would involve military engagements away from the promised land. Taking the city. It is important to note that Israel's approach in attacking distant cities was different from their approach when they attacked the cities in the land of Canaan. God commanded Israel many times to destroy the people in the Canaanite cities and show them no mercy. During their invasion of Canaan, not only were the Jews to slay all the citizens, but they were also to destroy everything connected with the wicked Canaanite religious system, including temples, idols, and altars. This policy would help remove dangerous temptations from the Jewish people who were always prone to follow idols. Upon arriving at a foreign city, the officer's first responsibility was to offer terms of peace. If the people accepted the terms, then the city and its inhabitants would be spared, but the city would be put under tribute to Israel. This involved paying an annual levy to Israel and making their citizens bondservants to the Israelites. And there are references to Joshua. During King David's reign, there was a special officer in Israel who was in charge of forced labor, and a reference to 2 Samuel. Because of his extensive building programs, King Solomon expanded this office and even included Israelites in the workforce. And there's reference to 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. It was this burden that made Judah finally revolt against Solomon's son, Rehoboam, and secede from the kingdom, and a reference to 1 Kings. If the people refused Israel's offer of peace, then the Jewish army was permitted to besiege the city, trusting God to give them the victory. The males in the city would be slain, reference to Numbers. The women and the children would be taken as servants, and the spoils in the city would be divided among the soldiers. Though some well-meaning people don't like the military metaphors in the Bible, the church today is in a battle against the world, the flesh, and the devil, and there are references to Ephesians and 2 Timothy. But we are also ambassadors of peace who wear the shoes of the preparation of the gospel of peace, a reference to Ephesians, and plead with rebellious sinners to be reconciled to God, and a reference to 2 Corinthians. Jesus brought his message of peace to his own people, and they rejected it. And there are references to Luke and John for that. So he had to place the author of peace with an announcement of judgment, reference to Luke. In AD 70, the Roman army destroyed Jerusalem and killed, captured, or scattered the people, and there were no political nation of Israel until May 14th, 1948. Verses 19 to 20, taking care of natural resources. Just as Israel was to be mindful of the God-given resources in their own land, they were cautioned not to waste natural resources in other lands. Defeating the enemy was important, but conserving natural resources was also important. When the Lord really wanted to humble a nation, he commanded his people to destroy the good trees, a reference to 2 Kings. But this approach was an exception. The other trees could be used for making siege works, but the fruit trees had to be preserved, for the tree of the field is man's life.
So what did you say? Normally when they besieged the land, they destroyed all the trees?
When the Lord really wanted to humble a nation, he commanded the people to destroy the good trees.
When the Lord wanted.
Is it just in the land of Canaan that he ordered the destruction of or wait a minute. Outside, well, do you think he preserved those fruit trees or the trees that provided for them because the people were going to come in and the Israelites were going to come in and take over? Where normally if they were going to, if they were not going to inhabit a region, they would just destroy everything. Is that the difference?
Well, I think maybe because it says the other trees, like let's say all your other wood, not your fruit trees, it said they could be used for making siege works. Now, I'm assuming that means like stuff maybe
battering, like battering rams and
Rams,
stuff.
yeah.
yes. Where the fruit trees, it says the tree of the field is a man's life. So
Income.
that's right.
So if they humbled them by taking their income. So what was that saying again? When the Lord wanted to humble a nation, he destroyed.
He commanded his people to destroy the good trees.
And then was there a verse with that?
Yes, 2 Kings 3:15-17.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting.
It says, the tree of the field is a man's life, whether the man or woman is an ally or an enemy. It would take years to replace wantonly destroyed trees. War is destructive enough without adding to the ruin and waste. And then there is a note here. It says, it's from the NIV. Are the trees of the field people that you should besiege them? God permitted the Jews to wage war against rebellious people, but not against his creation. And that's all I have for chapter 20.
Okay. 20 verse 1-4. Moses' next message for Israel concerned how to conduct themselves during war, especially in the forthcoming battles for the Promised Land. This message was as much for General Joshua as it was for the people and their military commanders. It seems that every army Israel met was larger than they were in number, and yet God constantly commanded and assured his people, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord is your God. For the Lord your God is with you. The priest was to lead the way into battle and give the troops a divine pep talk beforehand, reminding them not to fear the enemy because the Lord would fight against their enemies and give Israel victory. This exhortation was extremely important. The previous generation of Israelites died in the wilderness because they had succumbed to the fear of Canaan's inhabitants and failed to trust that God would provide for them. Therefore, the current generation needed to learn from the mistake of their ancestors. We all too often fail to follow the Lord and do as his word commands because we fear the world, what we think, what they will think of us or do to us. Instead, we must trust that our King will provide the means to accomplish the kingdom agenda that he commands of us. Verses 5-9. God permitted soldiers exemption from a given battle if they met any of the 4 conditions. The first 3 were related. If they built a house and hadn't been able to live in it yet, if they planted a new vineyard whose fruit they had not enjoyed, or if they were engaged and waiting to be married. Each of these involves a lack of fulfillment in pursuing one of life's basic pleasures. They may have been chosen by God to illustrate the ways in which he intended his people to enjoy the good land that he had given them. The 4th exemption involved a soldier with a cowardly heart. He was sent home, not for his own sake, but so that he would not demoralize his brothers, which could have disastrous consequences. 10-14. Israel's approach to war was not indiscriminate. As Moses' instructions make clear, enemy cities outside the promised land were to be offered terms of peace, which they could accept on the condition of becoming forced laborers of Israel. Refusing the offer, however, led to a siege, the death of all a city's men, and the taking of their goods as plunder. 15 through 20. But no such offer of peace was to be made to the Canaanites. Israel was to completely destroy every living thing among them. Otherwise, survivors would teach the Israelites to do all the detestable acts they did for their gods. Oh, that makes sense to me now, because they come through the land becomes their vassals, but they're not living in that land. They just own that land, and those people pay tribute to them. They're going to live in the land of Canaanite, which was given to them. So God didn't want those people in there. That makes sense to me now. Maybe you guys got that yesterday, but I didn't. To completely destroy every living thing among them. Otherwise, survivors would teach the Israelites to do all the detestable acts they did for their gods and cause the people to sin against the Lord. This matter was crucially important because Israel had already demonstrated a propensity to adopt the false religious practices of the surrounding nations. Also, Israel was to refrain from the common practice in ancient warfare of punishing a defeated enemy by decimating its land. After all, Canaan was to be Israel's possession. Well, I guess too, if they don't destroy the trees in Canaan, because he said not to destroy them, right? That would allow them to have income and food, and because they were staying there. That's the end for chapter 20. Kim, did you get...
Was the Gaza Strip originally in that land of Canaan?
Yeah. The Gaza Strip is actually where the tribe of Dan was supposed to be. But they went to the north, and they are still in the north.
Who ended up in Gaza then? Just in general population?
Yeah, I don't know. I know they allow the Palestinians to have control there, even though they actually own the land.
Right. Israel gave that to them in 1948. What I find interesting is, Moses is making several addresses to this second generation. And the resounding theme I'm hearing is you need not just about idolatry and all that, but it's like you need to learn from the history of your ancestors. And so that makes me think today, where people just want to wipe out history. That's ludicrous. You learn from the history and you take that and move forward. And so I don't want to rile any feathers here, but tearing down a statue, I often say, oh, do you feel better now? Because that's not it. This is inside of us, and learning and growing.
Doesn't
So
change history just because you tore down a statue.
Exactly. It happened.
It erases it, which is actually, I think, insulting to the people that went through that.
Right. Either side. I mean, we could say the Civil War, either side.
Yep.
And it just blows me away. And I'm always like, yeah, that'll do it. Okay, cheer and clap. But you know what? There's still issues from the Civil War in our country today. Okay. And how have we moved forward?
Agreed.
Well, where I live in Lee County, Florida. Well, guess who that was named after?
Robert E. Lee.
And they wanted to take down every statue, bust, and everything of that man when you know what was going on.
Robert E. Lee was dearly loved, actually, in the South, which you know.
He was.
But
and they
what's
wanted to
interesting
change our
is
county. They wanted to change the name of our county.
Well, he and Grant went to West Point, and the North originally wanted Robert E. Lee, and he just said he couldn't do it. You know, he couldn't do it to Virginia. You know, whatever. I don't know what the reasons were, but yeah, I just saw two schools stripped away the Confederate names of the school. Now they're reinstating it.
Well, come
I
on.
don't know. I just
Look at the football
just think
team,
there's
the Redskins. It's ridiculous that
exactly.
we're bowing the knee to such stupidity.
Well, you can see it in anything, like you said, sports, whatever.
I quit watching football because it all entered there. It's like, it's football. I just want to watch football. I don't want to hear different people's political opinions. And I'm sorry, when you bow the knee and refuse to do the Pledge of Allegiance for all the people that went to war before you, including
Right.
my brother who served 20 years and now deals with PTSD all the time. You're disrespecting them too at the same time. So
That's right.
play football and get your $1 million paycheck and be quiet.
Your $1 million paycheck, which you don't deserve.
I agree.
Play football.
So it obvious was important to Moses. I guess he had to, okay, all right, guys, listen.
Don't forget.
I'm wondering what their response was, because if you've lived through it like the first generation did, you know, if you're in the second or third generation, I'm not sure, you know, it'd be like, all right, okay, yeah. I don't know if they would get it. I don't know.
Well, and at this point, the older generation was killed off. So God had said to them, teach your children. Like, so they had 40 years to do the right thing and teach the children. So hopefully they did, because they knew their punishment. They were there for their punishment or their consequence of being disobedient. So, I mean, if I were that generation and I knew that I'm wandering in the desert because of the decision I made and my children were paying that price, I would definitely be making sure that they understood. I guess we'll find out in Joshua.
Yeah.
All right. My 21 has a break at 9.
So mine.
So is mine.
Okay, so does someone want to volunteer to read chapter 21, verse 1 through 9?
Yeah, I'll do it. Oh, Kim, go ahead, honey.
Please go ahead. I feel like I read them all the time, but I'm happy to do it.
All right. Cleansing for unsolved murder. When you're in the land the Lord your God is giving you, someone may be found murdered in a field. You don't know who committed the murder. In such a case, your elders and judges must measure the distance from the site of the crime to the nearby towns. When the nearest town has been determined, that town's elders must select from the herd a heifer. Sorry, I couldn't say it right. A heifer. Yeah, all right, hold on. Yeah, that has never been trained or yoked to a plow. They must lead it down to a valley that has not been plowed or planted and that has a stream running through it. There in the valley, they must break the heifer's neck. Then the Levitical priest must step forward, for the Lord your God has chosen them to minister before him and to pronounce blessings in the Lord's name. They are to decide all legal and criminal cases. The elders of the town must wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken. Then they must say, our hands did not shed this person's blood, nor did we see it happen. O Lord, forgive your people Israel, whom you have redeemed. Do not charge your people with the guilt of murdering an innocent person. Then they will be absolved of the guilt of this person's blood. By following these instructions, you will do what is right in the Lord's sight and will cleanse the guilt of murder from your community. Okay, so somebody's getting away with murder here.
I know, that's what I was thinking. And then I was thinking blood for blood. Again, that blood
I know.
covering the blood of the murder.
I know.
But who's getting away with murder?
They don't know.
There's atonement for them through this. Maybe we'll find out from John or Warren
Okay.
or Tony.
Okay. An overview 21:1-9. It's not known who killed him. This law, which dealt with an unsolved homicide, was not given elsewhere in the Pentateuch. In the event that the guilty party was unknown, justice could not adequately be served. However, the people were still held responsible to deal with the crime. The elders of the city closest to the place where the body of a dead man was found were to accept responsibility for the crime. This precluded inner city strife. In case relatives sought revenge, they would go to a valley, parentheses, idol altars were always on high places, so this avoided association with idolatry, close parentheses, and there break the neck of a heifer, indicating that the crime deserved to be punished. But the hand washing of the elders would show that although they accepted responsibility for what had happened, they were nevertheless free from the guilt attached to the crime. 21:5. This distinctly indicates that final judicial authority in the theocracy of Israel rested with the priests. So the priests would,
Take the responsibility.
yeah,
Okay, so justice, in the beginning, you said justice could not be served. I started a sentence.
in the event that the guilty party was unknown, justice could not adequately be served. However, the people were still held responsible to deal with the crime.
The people
Yeah.
were still responsible.
Yeah.
So breaking this heifer thing, breaking the neck is a kind of a retribution,
Atonement or
Yeah,
Yeah.
so in Leviticus, we've been studying Leviticus, and so when you place the hand on, there was a transfer of sin, and then the blood was the covering of, so it was a transfer that happened. You transferred your sin for that life of that animal, which is what Jesus does for us. So then, okay, so they washed their hands, although accepting responsibility, they accepted responsibility, but what did it say? That
Hold on.
almost like the last sentence that you said.
Yeah. They accepted responsibility for what had happened. They were nevertheless, though, free from the guilt attached to the crime. So they weren't guilty, but they had to accept responsibility. And like Kathy said, you know, kill the heifer.
But free
Sure.
from guilt attached to the crime.
Right. Wonder how often that happened.
I'm gonna guess very rarely, because like Israel's murder rate is extremely low. I want to say it's like 1 to 100,000.
Wow.
I feel like that's the data that I read a couple weeks ago. You know, and if you look at the United States murder rate, I don't know if anybody's got any Google handy, but you know, look at the murders in the United States for, I would go before 2020 though, because I feel like those numbers are skewed after, but like say 2019 or 2018 murder rate in the United States per capita versus murder rate in Israel. Like there was a point when it was like one murder in the entire country of Israel for the entire year.
I did hear on the news yesterday that a pregnant girl was killed in, I guess it was Harrisburg, and they're calling it a double homicide because her and the unborn baby both died.
As it should be.
Yes. But Harrisburg's something else.
Well, and then I saw some woman saying the church and the pastors need to step up, and it's like, no, everybody has to take responsibility.
Well, but even if the church and the pastor step up, they can only do so much. I mean, you know, you can talk to somebody, but that doesn't mean it's going to prevent.
Well, but this is the thing. Your children are your responsibility. The church's responsibility is to support you as you raise your child in helping instill those values. But the home is like, the home is the main teacher. And everyone wants to say, oh, the church. Yeah, the church does have, go ahead. Did you get it?
Well, it showed with Israel what you said, 1 in 100,000. But as of 2023, it's 4 in 100,000.
I wasn't sure if they would include the war and everything that's going on as murder numbers.
Could be.
Yeah, but I think it's backwards. Like you know, I heard someone say one time, oh well, we don't go to church, but we send our kids to Shalom, so they're getting it. And it's like, it's
But
not
they're
the
not-
school's job to raise your child. It's not the church's job to raise your child. It is the family's job to raise the child, and the church supports the family. We get the children sometimes 1 hour a week. What's happening in the rest of those hours?
Yep.
Yeah, and with a lot
Same
of
way with
kids,
school.
it's the home life. I mean, I know people who send their kids to church, but they on a church bus, but they don't go. You know, so okay, great, you're sending your kid to church, but it's like you say, they might be there an hour, maybe 2 if they're lucky, through the week. But then what's going on in the rest of the time at home?
Oh, we never see behavior like this at home. I've heard it a million times.
Because you're not paying attention.
Yeah.
Okay. Kathy, did you read yours? You didn't yet.
No, not yet.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. This is 1 through 9, chapter 21. Atoning the land. The land belonged to God, and the people living on it were his tenants. Their sins not only grieved the Lord, but also defiled the land, especially the sins of sexual immorality, with a reference to Leviticus, and murder, with a reference to Numbers. The shedding of innocent blood was a terrible crime in Israel. When Cain killed his brother Abel, the ground received Abel's blood and cried out to God for justice. References to Genesis and Hebrews. God keeps a record of the innocent blood shed by both animals and people, and one day will call for an accounting.
Oh, what's that? Genesis? It's Genesis 3?
Genesis 4, 10 to 12.
10 to 12. And then the Hebrew?
12, 24.
Okay.
I like this where it says God keeps a record of the innocent blood shed by both animals and people, because, of all the innocent people that get killed, you know, who stands up for that? Or
Yeah. Well, animals too. I thought that's interesting. He included animals.
yeah. When he avenges blood, he remembers them. He does not forget the cry of the humble. Psalm 9:12. When the Lord comes to judge, the earth will bear witness of the innocent blood that was shed. And there's a reference to Isaiah. The elders and judges mentioned in Deuteronomy 21:2 are probably the sanctuary court mentioned in 17:8-13.
What's that Isaiah reference?
26:21.
I would love to find the verse for the animals. Go ahead.
They are probably the sanctuary court mentioned in 17:8-13, and this would include the priest in 21:5. This was the highest tribunal in the land, and murder was a heinous crime. Furthermore, nobody had yet measured to see which city was nearest, so the elders and judges couldn't have come from that city. Once the nearest city had been determined, the elders of that city participated in the assigned ritual. We assume that the elders and judges investigated the case thoroughly before they took the steps outlined in these verses. And there is a note here. The fact that a certain city was the nearest to the corpse didn't mean that one of its citizens was guilty of the crime. It was necessary to involve the leaders of a neighboring city because the elders there knew the terrain and would represent the local citizens. The sanctuary court was in charge, but they respected the local authorities. The offering of the red heifer was not like the offering of a sacrifice at the sanctuary. For one thing, the priest didn't slay the animal and catch its blood. Laman beheaded the beast in the valley, and the priest only witnessed the deed. The officers washed their hands over the dead animal, and there's a reference to Matthew, confessed their innocence, and prayed for the Lord to forgive his people, and he did. Of course, this didn't mean that the unknown guilty murderer was automatically forgiven, but rather that the Lord would cleanse the land and forgive Israel the sin that had been committed. God's justice was upheld and God's law was obeyed, even though the culprit wasn't known. That this ritual relates to Jesus Christ and his atoning work on the cross is clear from the elders' words. Do not lay innocent blood to the charge of your people Israel. Deuteronomy 21:8. On that tragic day when Israel asked to have her Messiah crucified, Pilate washed his hands and said, I am innocent of this man's blood.
Oh, never made that connection before.
And the people replied, let his blood be on us and on our children. A reference to Matthew.
Matthew
27:24-25.
Pilate.
Like that innocent heifer, Jesus died for the nation and even prayed from the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Luke 23:34. Jesus fulfilled God's will and upheld his holy law, and God withheld his judgment from Israel for approximately 40 years. Jesus died for the sins of the world, reference to John and 1 John, and he died for the church, a reference to Ephesians, and for the people of Israel, for the transgression of my people was he stricken, a reference to Isaiah. The entire ritual speaks of the grace of God, for man's works could never earn God's forgiveness. The red heifer had never been worked, the ground in the valley had never been tilled, and the elders, judges, and priests had done nothing special to merit God's forgiveness for his people. The sacrifice wasn't even made at the sanctuary or offered by a priest. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Ephesians 2:8-9. The offering of the innocent red heifer pointed to the offering of the Son of God, whose death brought cleansing, forgiveness, and the annulment of God's judgment.
Does it say red heifer?
Yes.
Does any of your versions say red heifer? Mine just says heifer.
Mine just says heifer.
Interesting.
Reviewing this section of the law, we're impressed with the fact that God wanted his people to enjoy living in their land, and the secret of this enjoyment was obedience to his will. Crime and injustice defiled the land. God didn't want his land defiled. The godless nations in Canaan so polluted the land that it vomited them out. And there's a reference to Leviticus. Apart from Israel, no nation of the world is in a covenant relationship with God, but the Lord still holds all nations accountable for their sins. Reference to Amos. One day, God will judge the nation in righteousness, and nobody will escape. And there's a reference to Joel. That's all I have for 1-9.
Okay, mine's very short. No detail of Israel's life escaped God's notice and concern, as Moses' address makes clear. The cold case of an unserved murder required a sacrifice because life was precious to God, because the victim's blood had to be atoned for. So God instituted the unique ceremony described in these verses to satisfy his holiness and to purge the land of innocent blood spilled. I wonder how this is connected to the red heifer that we've been kind of watching with Connie.
Well, that's what I was thinking about too, but
In the beginning of Worsby, Kathy, didn't it say that this red heifer is not a sacrifice? Go back to
Yeah.
the beginning of Worsby. It said it wasn't related to that, I think.
Okay.
yeah, it says the offering of the red heifer was not like the offering of a sacrifice at the sanctuary. For
Okay.
one thing, the priest didn't slay the animal and catch its blood. The layman beheaded the beast in the valley, and the priest only witnessed the deed. And then the officers washed their hands over the dead animal, confessed their innocence, and prayed for the Lord to forgive the people, and he did. So it wasn't a sacrifice in the sense that the red heifer is going to be sacrificed or has been.
It just feels like it's more blood for blood. But I get there's got to be a cost, and so the heifer probably was a commodity. You know what I mean? Like a sacrifice on behalf.
And it's not saying here either, like the red heifer that we're looking at that's supposed to come. It's not saying this was a perfect,
True.
like no blemishes. It's not saying that.
But did Worsby say that they beheaded? Because this just says it broke the young cow's neck. Did Worsby say that they cut its head off?
It said that they beheaded it.
That's what I thought. But my Bible just said they broke
Yeah,
its neck.
mine just says break the neck of the heifer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's what mine said too.
Anybody have any notes?
Let me
What
look.
did John say for that?
Hold on.
See, mine says, and then down in 6, it says, wash your hands over the heifer whose neck was broken.
Yeah, John says break the neck of a heifer, indicating that the crime deserved to be punished. But the hand washing of the elders would show that they accepted responsibility, but they were not guilty. I would think they would do something with blood.
Yeah. I also never connected Pilate washing his hands and saying,
I
like,
didn't
I never
either.
connected that to back here. That they were
Now I get it.
innocent.
Well, the other thing it said about that red heifer, where they took it to the valley. Okay, they took it to the valley. And it said the red heifer had never been worked, the ground in the valley had never been tilled, and the elders and judges and priests had done nothing special. Oh my gosh, I can't read. Had done nothing special to merit God's forgiveness for his people. And it wasn't made at the sanctuary or offered by the priest. So this was like totally different from
The temple worship or sacrifice.
right.
Any other thoughts? All right.
So in my footnote regarding Pilate washing his hands,
Yeah.
I think that refers to kind of my footnote here says when a crime was committed and the criminal got away, the whole community was held responsible, which is kind of what Pilate was saying. In much the same way, if a city has a dangerous intersection and someone is killed there, the community may be held responsible for both damages and repairs. God was pointing to the need for the whole community to feel a keen sense of responsibility for what was going on around them and to move to correct any situations that are potentially harmful, physically, socially, or morally.
Well, think of today. You know how there's a terrible intersection. You know it is, cars are flying, and it isn't until somebody dies,
Yeah.
tragically, that the community decides, oh, we need a stoplight.
That's a good point. Yeah, if we know there's something happening and we do nothing to correct it. Good study. All right. Well, this concludes the reading of God's word for today. We will pick back up tomorrow, chapter 21, verse 10.
Good.